Our first speaker is Sue Ellen Browder, a freelance writer, speaker, and investigative journalist who wrote for Cosmopolitan, New Woman, Women's Day, and other magazines, where she described the women's movement as it unfolded on the public stage and behind the scenes. She has appeared on Oprah, The Today Show, and hundreds of radio talk shows. Her recent book, Subverted: How I Helped the Sexual Revolution Hijack the Women's Movement, documents how the women's movement, which fought for equal opportunity in education and the workplace, came to be united with the sexual revolution, which reduced women to sex objects. She will share part of that story with us today, as well as argue that the true feminist movement is one that embraces women's capacity for love and life. Sue Ellen, welcome to the United Nations. You have the floor.
Thank you so much, Your Excellencies, distinguished panelists, fellow panelists, dear ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honor to be here. As I say, I wrote for Cosmopolitan for more than 20 years, and I'm here to confess that the sex revolution feminism I once believed in and promoted to single career women was based on half-truth, selected truth, and truth out of context, which is how Jacques Ellul defined propaganda. I now realize, after all these years, that the pro-life movement represented by these women and countless others on the panel, but these women on the panel, is the most authentic women's movement of the 21st century. How did I come to this conclusion? Well, I was inspired to write this book, and the research I found changed my mind. It's called Subverted, as he said, How I Helped the Sexual Revolution Hijack the Women's Movement. It all started in 1971, long time ago, when I was at Cosmo at my little blue desk, and I noticed something that has now been forgotten. And it was very obvious in those days that the sexual revolution and the feminist movement were two radically different movements. Betty Friedan, who had launched the feminist movement in 1963 with her book, The Feminine Mystique, had called Cosmopolitan quite obscene and quite horrible. Helen Gurley Brown, who was the editor of Cosmo, would have loved for her magazine to be part of the feminist movement, but Betty Friedan didn't go for it at all. She said anything that reduced a woman to a sex object, as we were doing at Cosmo, was a betrayal of women. So how did we get to the point where so many young women today think that to be free is to go to college, get a great degree, have a fantastic job, and be as sexually free as possible? How did those two once distinctly separate movements ever get joined together? Well, I began to ask that question, and as I started to write this book, again, Subverted, I found the answer. I didn't know it before I started researching it. It took me 5 years to research it. What I discovered came as a great surprise to me. The real conflict between women, the women on this panel, the pro-life women and the pro-abortion women, is not over feminism per se. We all agree that women should be treated with equal dignity and respect. We all agree women should have the right to vote. The real war on women is the false joining of feminism with the sexual revolution. What strong pro-life feminists like the women on this panel oppose is destroying a woman's dignity by reducing her personhood to her sex organs, her sexual desirability, and her sexual urges, and then pretending that this animalistic reduction of her dignity is somehow a form of freedom. To bring peace to this war on women and this war between women in our nation and the world, we need to separate true feminism out from the sexual revolution in our minds and the minds of others. So let's start by looking at the old feminism as it started in the 1960s, when the so-called mother of the women's movement, that was Betty Friedan, launched the second wave feminism in 1963. She didn't even mention abortion and contraception in the first edition of her book. It wasn't on her radar. She defended the family, and she was deeply opposed to treating women as sex objects, as we were doing as Cosmo. What Betty and other feminists were fighting for in the 1960s had nothing to do with who you sleep with or how you have sex. It had nothing to do with that. They were fighting for equal opportunity for women in academia and the workforce. Women were entering the workforce in droves, and we were being fired for being pregnant. I was fired for being pregnant. Help wanted ads in newspapers were divided into help wanted male, all the good jobs, and help wanted female, all the bad jobs, the low-paying jobs. People have forgotten this. Many law schools and med schools were closed to women. A married woman couldn't apply for credit in her own name. So women were quite unified in wanting to put a stop to all this. That was feminism, and it was a very unifying movement. But the sexual revolution was an entirely different matter, with two separate movements. When I went to work for Cosmo in 1971, Cosmo was the first sex revolution magazine for women in the nation. Just as it was copied after Playboy. Cosmo was a female Playboy. And just as Hugh Hefner had created the Playboy bunny, Helen Gurley Brown created the Cosmo Pussycat. Now, let's see how you're reducing human beings down to animals. Well, it all started with Kinsey. He reduced human beings down to an animal. Then Hugh Hefner did it at Playboy. He was called Kinsey's pamphleteer. And then Cosmo copied Playboy. And here again, we've got a reduction of a woman just to her sexuality. Cosmo was a Playboy clone. And it was a female Playboy, and it still is today. And Helen had a favorite slogan that was embroidered on a little pillow that she kept in her office. And the slogan said, "Good girls go to heaven, bad girls go everywhere." And that said it all. At Cosmo, we turned all traditional values upside down. We sold single working women on the idea that it was good to live with your boyfriend, good to sleep with your married boss. You could get ahead that way. Good to take the pill, good or at least necessary to have an abortion to get ahead. It was all about getting ahead. In the early 1970s, all of this came as a shock to most Americans. If a lot of single women were going to bed on the first and second date and hopping into bed all the time with men, they surely weren't talking about it. You couldn't find these women. They didn't exist, or they were, as I say, there were very few of them. And that's why when I went to work at Cosmo in the 1970s, we made most of those stories up about those women. Helen Gurley Brown even had a list of rules, which I have. I've kept it all these years. I've got it at home. 50 years I've kept this list of rules on how to make up stories, and also how to make up experts. To quote, if you couldn't find somebody who said that this sexually free lifestyle was good for women, you could make up an expert. And welcome to the media fantasy world. Okay, this is propaganda 101 here. So unlike feminism, which was very unifying for women, the sexual revolution was a very divisive movement. You know, truth, beauty, and goodness pull us together. They unite us. And what does evil do? It divides people. It separates us. So at Cosmo, listen to the splits. We split sex from love. Sex is just for fun. If it feels good, do it. We split sex from marriage. It's okay to live with your boyfriend, and if you don't, we split women from men. If you don't like him, just divorce him. We advocated divorce as a good thing and a happy thing. And we split sex from babies. If you take the pill, and if the pill fails, as it sometimes will, get an abortion. Betty Friedan, the feminist, the mother of the feminist movement, as I said, was so appalled by Cosmo, she called it quite obscene and quite horrible, and she even urged women to boycott the magazine. When I was at Cosmo, I was married with a child, and I knew the sexual revolution wasn't for me. But I thought the women's movement was for me, the feminist movement. What I didn't know, and I didn't know until I wrote this book, is that behind the scenes, even before I arrived here in New York City, abortion, contraception, and the sex revolution's false promise that splitting sex from love actually empowers women had already been inserted into the women's movement, largely due to the efforts of two men I had never even heard of at the time, One was a magazine writer named Larry Lader. The other was Dr. Bernard Nathanson. Said he later became pro-life and took responsibility for 75,000 abortions. They were the two founders of the National Abortion Rights Action League, now called NARAL Pro-Choice America, and originally called the National Association to Repeal Abortion Laws. The National Association to Repeal Abortion Laws was basically a white upper-class men's movement until the feminists took it over. Sometimes called the father of the abortion rights movement, Later was a sexual revolution radical. He was a population controller, and he was a biographer of Planned Parenthood founder Margaret Sanger. He called Maggie the greatest influence in his life. He was a master propagandist. He understood the interconnectedness of all humanity, as these people do here on this room, and he had developed deep insights into how a culture works. Now listen to this, is what he said, and this is his quote. He wrote that to tamper with abortion meant, quote, the whole system of sexual morality in America could come tumbling down. He knew that the abortion was the kingpin, and that's what happened. Over the past 50 years, as we've seen, this has happened. And to make it happen, because abortion was his greatest desire, to make abortion legal, he said that pro-abortion men had to, quote, recruit the feminists. Now, these are things that were told to us by an eyewitness who was there. Dr. Bernard Nathanson later spilled the beans, or we wouldn't know this happened. Because it couldn't be men promoting abortion, it had to be women. And here's the tipping point. Later was good friends with Betty Friedan. We don't know exactly what he said to Betty to convince her. We know he worked at it a long time, according to Dr. Bernard Nathanson. We don't know how, but we do know that Betty was eventually convinced to insert abortion as a right into the feminist movement. It's all in the book. Chapter 5 tells you how. But we know the exact hour when it happened. It took me many years to find this. It was on November 18th, 1967, in the Chinese room of the Mayflower Hotel in Washington, D.C., 103 feminists, mostly women, a few men, had gathered for the National Organization for Women's second annual convention to vote on their political Bill of Rights, which to some extent still guides the pro-abortion feminist movement today. They voted on 8 rights that Saturday, and 6 passed unanimously. One was a mother's right not to be fired for being pregnant. Another was the right for working parents to deduct home and child care expenses on their income taxes. Another called for a woman's right to be educated to her full potential. Pretty reasonable stuff we'd probably all agree on. Only 2 rights that night were controversial among the feminists in the Chinese room. One was the call for the passage of the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment. That one's now history. That one failed to be ratified by 2/3 of the states in the U.S. The other right, which created an absolute uproar that night, was the call to repeal all abortion laws. Betty surprised many delegates by presenting abortion as the last right to be discussed, and the meeting spiraled out of control. It was a microcosm of what the whole world is still fighting over today. These were all feminists in that room. Remember, these are all feminists. One of them says, "I'm against murder." The big fight lasted until almost midnight, and when the dust settled, only 57 people, just 57 people, had voted to insert abortion and contraception into the feminist movement's Bill of Rights. And what does evil do? It splits us apart. At that very hour, the women's movement, the feminist movement, split into 2 factions, feminists for legalizing abortions and feminists who opposed it. 1/3 of those women in that room walked out and later resigned from NOW over the abortion vote. And that divisive plank number 8 on abortion is the only right in NOW's political platform that we're still fighting over today. Why? Because it was inserted through deception and error, largely due to the influence of 2 men most of us have never even heard of. But the problem was that after the big fight in the Chinese room, all of this was glossed over, and that entire Bill of Rights, including that intensely disputed abortion right number 8, was sold as a package to the American public. And even many Catholics and Christians bought into the lie that all, quote, liberated women have unanimously agreed that all of these rights are necessary for a woman to take charge of her life and be free. On Monday morning, Betty Friedan holds a press conference and hands out a press release in which she claims, and this is what she claimed, she was very good at manipulating the media because she was a media person herself. Here's a quote of her from her press release. She claimed to be speaking for, now listen to this, 28 million American working women, the millions of women emerging from our colleges each year, and mothers emerging from their homes to go back to work. Basically, she claimed to be speaking for all working women in America when she was speaking for only 57 people and herself in the Chinese room. And that's how propaganda works, my friends. The next day, the Washington Post, remember there was no reporter in that room that night, so they didn't see the big battle that happened. The Washington Post bought the story, they headlined the abortion vote and reported, now listen to this, now supports the furthering of the sexual revolution of our century. Now supports the furthering of the sexual revolution of our century by pressing for widespread sex education and provision of birth control information and contraceptive, and by urging that all laws penalizing abortion be repealed. Over the next several years, as the media repeatedly told this only half-true story, when I was one of them at Cosmo, I told it too, many Americans bought into the illusion that abortion was a right all liberated women had always wanted and needed to be free. And now here we sit, 50 years later, fighting over that abortion right number 8. That's how the 1960s women movement, which was a very unifying movement for women, became a very divisive movement for the sexual revolution. Now this is very interesting because where did all those women go? Where did all those women go that walked out from that meeting? Well, one of them was named Betty Boyer. She was a lawyer from Cleveland. She went back to Cleveland. She said a human life is a sacred trust. And she said that she was going to give women the movement that she had promised them from the beginning. Although Wheel didn't win all these victories by themselves, Wheel fought to get rid of help-wanted male and help-wanted female ads in newspapers. They fought for married women to get equal credit for themselves without having a man sign for them. They fought for women's sports programs. They got help to get the Pregnancy Discrimination Act of 1968 passed that made it illegal to fire a woman for being pregnant. So all of these battles that women were fighting, WEAL, Women's Equity Action League, was involved in. I think it's safe to say, however, that WEAL did a huge amount of the work. And in the media fantasy world, the kind of world that I come from, pro-abortion feminists got most of the credit. So what happened here is, again, we think that there's only one kind of feminism and it's all about abortion. No, there's two feminists. These are all feminists up here too, and they're defending the truth about women. Now here's something you never hear in the media fantasy world. It took me a long time to find this too. By 1979, now, the National Organization for Women had 100,000 members. Pretty good, right? The National Right to Life Committee, which represents the pro-life family feminist movement sitting up here today, had 11 million members, 110 times as many. Power in a free world does not come from the top down, or it shouldn't. It grows from the ground up. The pro-life family feminist movement, represented by these women sitting up here, please listen to them because they have a lot of good things to say, had the grassroots of power in America in 1979, and they continue to have this grassroots power both in this country and around the world today. Pope John Paul II urged Christians to create a new feminism, and I believe these pro-life feminist women have already been doing exactly that. Promoting the sexual revolution and calling it feminism will never bring peace to the world. It will only create more divisions. Remember what Larry later said: to tamper with abortion meant a nation's whole system of sexual morality could come tumbling down. We must stop trying to export this Western error to the rest of the world. Fight for equal opportunities for women in education and the workforce. Separate feminism from the sexual revolution in your minds and hearts, so this cheap imitation of reality no longer has power over us. Then we will at last set women and girls truly free. Thank you, my friends.
Understand better how the sexual revolution has impacted the women's movement and the lives of so many women, obscuring their true dignity, reducing their identity to their sexual urges and desirability, and splitting sex from love, marriage, and babies. Thanks likewise for outlining the paths of a truly feminine feminism, and I hope I can be part of it too. I would now like to turn to Dr. Susan Yoshihara, a writer, researcher, a former U.S. Navy commander and combat logistics helicopter pilot, a wife and mother of 2 school-age daughters. She is the author of 2 books on international security and many articles on human rights and humanitarianism. She is research director at the Center for Family and Human Rights. She serves on the board of the White House Fellows Foundation and is the founder of the American Council of Women, Peace and Security. Her talk is entitled "Seeing Through the Glass Ceiling, My Night with the Boat People," which will illustrate the way women in non-traditional fields, such as the military, not only bring unique feminine traits to bear, but how those feminine characteristics add great value. Susan, thank you for your participation in today's panel. We await your words.
Thank you, Father. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. As Sue Ellen brilliantly described, the women's movement, the sexual revolution, left some with the wrong impression that to be successful in a man's world, we need to leave our femininity at the door. I'll never forget the day I was teaching one of my workshops to a room full of senior flag and general officers from women all over the world, and I asked them to describe a time when being a woman was an asset in their career. Should have seen the look on their faces. A 2-star American general stood up and said, "In my 32 years, no one has ever asked me this." And she gave a great answer. Today, I want to tell you a personal story about the time I learned that success in a man's world is not just about breaking the glass ceiling, but finding satisfaction in serving on the way up. My back ached after 6 hours of flying. The glare of the sun off the South China Sea filled the helicopter cockpit with a sticky heat, but I didn't care. 3 weeks into my first deployment in 1989, this was my first real mission. Len, my co-pilot, and I were flying supplies we'd taken on board in Subic Bay, delivering them to the 5 other ships spread out across several miles of the carrier battle group. "You're on fire today, Lieutenant," seasoned first-class petty officer Mike Rogers said from the aft cabin. "Yeah, ma'am," airman chimed in, laying flat on his stomach at the cargo bay door. "You smoked that last drop." "Yeah, thanks to your great calls back there, Jonesy. Keep it up," I said very proudly. We had set up for a side flare maneuver on a frigate. Hands down, the side flare is the most fun you can have in a helicopter. You come in really low and fast over the flight deck on the ship's stern, turn the helicopter sideways, pull up on the collective, and stop the bird a couple of feet above a man in a yellow shirt with a hook above his head. And if he ducked, you made fun of him. This kind of flying called for visual acuity, hand-eye coordination, seat-of-the-pants decision-making, the ability to judge changes in angles and distances, and closure rates in fractions of seconds. A little cockiness was a virtue. Too much was lethal. I pushed the cyclic forward, dipped the nose of the aircraft over the ship's wake, pulled up on the collective, picked up airspeed, and set myself up for the same maneuver a little higher on the receiving ship. Night Rider 04, stand by for tasking, the air boss of my ship, USS San Jose, said over the radio, alerting us that we were about to take on a rescue mission. Looks like our banner day just got better, Redger said. Len told the crewmen to ready the aircraft for passengers. My fatigue from the pre-dawn brief and takeoff vanished. I was eager to take on the unknown. Night Rider 04, come in for crew swap. It was my fault. The crew was about to get bumped. The San Jose had come on a small, rickety boat full of passengers, and since I was one of 2 women in the battle group of 4,000 men, our ship's XO decided that he wanted me to take care of the women passengers. Never mind, I thought, that for the last 15 years we've been doing this mission without women in the battle group. My cheeks burned with humiliation. I was being yanked off the cockpit for being a woman. But to understand why I resented getting pulled out of the cockpit, I have to explain how I got into it. When I was 16 years old, a high school senior, my mother took me to a special service where the Naval Academy Choir sang, and John O'Connor, a former Navy chaplain and my parents' dear friend, presided. I was moved by the future Cardinal's sermon about self-sacrifice and his warmth when he met me. And something about the nuns there struck me too. I mean, why did abnegation make them so happy? I stopped my mother outside the door of the church, and I announced to her that after graduation, I would either join the sisters or the midshipmen. As soon as we get home, my mother said, I'll find the number to the Naval Academy. The prospect of going from an inner-city high school of 2,000 girls to the military college in Annapolis, the bastion of masculinity, was daunting, but comments like, do you really want to cut off all your hair and wear those ugly shoes? Just spurred me on. I had inherited my parents' deep love of country and a conviction that women could and should break into a man's world, compete on their terms, and win. The playing field was skewed from the start. Seats for women were capped and made more competitive because women were not allowed in combat. As one of the earliest classes with women, our arrival required an adjustment in attitude and behavior that few men could muster without coercion, mistakes, and anguish all around. At graduation 4 years later, 63 of us women in our class of 1,000 shook the top Navy admiral's hand and emerged with thicker skins, a keener sense of irony, and a little bitterness. That last year in Annapolis, I watched while men with lower class rankings selected elite combat ships, while I was left with auxiliary ships tied up to port, the dregs. I had heard that there was a way around the combat exclusion policy, though, that kept women off of those elite ships. By flying the H-46 helicopter, women deployed just like the men, but they weren't permanently part of the battle group. So a few weeks later at service selection night, I walked right past the table that would have delivered me, like my father and my brother before me, onto a surface ship and up to one presided over by 4 jocular men in flight suits. Before I could change my mind, I'd signed up for flight school, pinned a pair of gold wings on my lapel, and climbed back up the 2 flights of stairs to my room, where my roommates saw my wings and smiled and shook their heads. 2 years and a lot of training hours later, I arrived at my first squadron, a forward deployed squadron on Guam, a 32-mile island jutting out of the Marianas Trench. That was my home for the next 3.5 years. I'd graduated from flight school with high marks and a reputation as a good stick, excellence in flying. My first day in the squadron, wearing the standard khaki uniform, I made the rounds to check in. I thought the polyester slacks were kind of unfeminine, so I wore the skirt with the pumps, in the brown leather, which was coveted and reserved for naval aviators. And for my check-in interview that afternoon, I sat down on the faux leather couch with Commander Worley in his office. Ankles crossed, tucked to the side, hands folded. I imagined my mother nodding approvingly. The XO sat behind his broad desk, and after a few formalities, he leaned back and in his southern drawl said, "Lieutenant, you joined the Navy to be a man. I expect you to look like one. No skirts. Men might look up your legs in the ladder wells, and not just enlisted men either." "Commander," I said, "my mother had 2 sons, and I was not one of them. As long as I'm here, you can expect me to be a woman and act like a woman and look like a woman. Cocking his head and pursing his lips, Worley leaned back in the chair. I took his silence as a good sign. What came next, I can't really remember, but at some point he said, "And I don't want you getting pregnant while you're here. I want you to march yourself down to the flight surgeon and get yourself fixed up." "Sir, I'm not married and I do not plan to start a family at this command." "Well, now," his face twisted, "you know things happen." Within 5 minutes, my new boss had accused me of seduction, gender confusion, and promiscuity. Not a word about self-sacrifice and service. No interest in my personal moral code, much less confidence that I would be faithful to it. "Sir, I'm not married, and I do not plan to start a family at this command." Our eyes met. The clock on the commander's desk, in the shape of an airspeed indicator, ticked. He looked down, picked up my check-in folder from his desk, and said, "Why don't we talk about your aircraft qualifications?" In that first year, I watched men check in behind me and deploy before me while I waited and went to more training around Asia. The skipper said his boss wanted another woman to finish her training and go to sea with me so that no one used their feminine wiles to set up shop on board ship. When Brenda finally arrived, we were slated for a detachment with another new pilot, Jim. He shared my flaming red hair and a very competitive spirit. Our officer in charge, a fellow Naval Academy graduate from a class before women entered, tried to hide his chagrin at getting stuck with 2 women. I surmised his disapproval sprang from his traditional Catholic upbringing, so I didn't hate him for it. But I just wished he could square his values with equality of the sexes the way my father and my 2 brothers had. I forgave him, but I didn't like him much. 2 other aircraft commanders were assigned, Len and Steve, whom everybody called Mac, and he would eventually turn up his nose at helicopters and go fly jets. Len was soft-spoken, didn't play the game, and mostly ignored Mac and the other pilots. And Len had a popular wife with a baby on the way. He and I made the papers with a few rescues of surfers swept out to sea. He was a patient instructor, and I was glad to be deploying. On that August day in the South China Sea, Len and I had hit every ship in the battle group at least once. At last, I was pulling my weight, and getting yanked for being a woman just made me wonder if I could ever prove myself. The better I am, I thought, the more I threaten their egos. When Mac connived to take the flight from us, I was so angry, I cried. As the deck pitched and rolled with the rising wind speed, San Jose's crewman called me over the landing spot. I eased over the deck, dropped the collective, and brought the aircraft down with a thud so we didn't slide and hit the ship's superstructure. Mac stood outside the rotor arc, his grin beneath the dark visor on his helmet, his sleeves rolled up against regulation. The yellow shirts ran under the arc, chocks for the landing wheels, chains to tie us down, men in purple jerseys dragging the fuel hose toward us, gripping its heavy brass nozzle and leaning into the aircraft as they pulled. I handed the controls to Len. I felt Mac's finger tapping my shoulder. Without turning, I unhooked my kneeboard, shoved it in my helmet bag, threw my leg over the seat. Under the high-pitched whine of the forward transmission above me, as Mac jumped in the seat and plugged in his helmet to the auto cords I had just unhooked and started his turnover brief with Len, I hunched down, exited the rescue hatch onto the flight deck, careful not to hit my straps on anything as I went. Once in the hangar, I stopped just long enough to raise my visor and let my eyes adjust to the darkness outside. I took off my helmet, shook out my matted hair, bagged my gear, hung it in the para-rigger's shop, and headed forward to find the ship's XO. For 2 decades after the fall of Saigon at the end of the Vietnam War, 1 million people left Vietnam by boats. Known as boat people, they risked and lost their lives by the thousands to keep the faith. The XO tasked me with bathing the women. By mid-afternoon, I found myself down in the enlisted berthing in a large metal room with several open shower stalls that soon crowded with 20 of the 70 women. I pointed to the sinks and toilets and made hand signals to get the first ones to remove and pile their clothes in a corner. I broke open the boxes of Quell cream, applied it to their arms and leg, and motioned them to apply it to the rest of themselves. The women covered their breasts and averted their eyes. When it seemed like they understood the drill, I leaned into one of the metal stalls and I pushed the shower knob to demonstrate, repeating it a few times. The water stayed on only a few seconds to save water. Still, my flight suit, feeling gritty from the morning's flight, I unzipped it halfway down and tied the sleeves around my waist in a knot. My steel-tipped flight boots felt dry, but I realized I wasn't going to avoid soaking myself when I saw a woman just standing under a dripping spigot, her chin in her chest, her arms crossed, with her hands grabbing opposite shoulders. Will this night never end, I thought, scrubbing, shampooing, distributing towels, and now having to make my way over to this immobile woman. What happened next changed everything. As I approached her to turn on the water, she fell into one of those deep squats on her heels. I thought she was just accustomed to bathing that way, but when she threw up her two arms and crossed them over her head, I felt a sudden warm rush and I froze. Was she afraid I would hurt her? I motioned for her to stand. When she did, slowly, I saw a small white enamel medallion with a delicate painting of the Blessed Virgin Mary fastened around her neck by a thin chain. I hadn't seen another piece of jewelry all night, not a necklace, bracelet, watch, pair of earrings, only a rosary or two slipping out of pockets as clothes were being tossed into piles. When she looked at me, like she expected me to take her treasure, I knew the warm rush that I felt was shame. Seeing the medallion brought me back to my sisters in high school, to generous nuns who told us that we could achieve anything with God's help, to the love of my family so far away. As I handed out the clothes, I smiled. In their struggle to keep the men's dungarees on their tiny waists, they giggled. And one by one, they leaned into me for a hug. In the safety of that sea-born sorority, no one judged me, and with nothing to prove, I had so much to give. At 10:30, I collapsed on my rack in my stateroom next to Brenda. I was so grateful. Grateful for my emotionally distant roommate, for the sagging mattress, the anemic showers, the long loneliness that meant that I loved well, but most of all for my freedom, the freedom that I took for granted. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I tell you this personal story to make a few modest points. I am not saying that women should abandon ambition. Far from it. I mean, after all, if I had been tied up to appear somewhere, I wouldn't have been able to serve those women that night. Yet rank and title don't make us happy. It's service that makes us happy. That's what I learned that night. And service is not an entitlement. It's a duty. The second thing, jobs may be gender neutral, but people never are. We women are needed because of our unique feminine qualities and not in spite of them. And rather than compromise or hide them, we do well to value and celebrate them. And third, integration in the military services was made harder by the errors of the sexual revolution. As Commander Worley illustrated, it furthered the misunderstanding that we enter non-traditional fields either to be a man or to sleep with them. To the contrary, we women improve readiness. We bring something to the table that men cannot. And by valuing ourselves and our own integrity and treating other men like brothers, we improve readiness and mission accomplishment. And finally, girls graduating from high school and jockeying for careers still hear elite women tell them that they must strive to break the mythical glass ceiling. I wrote this story to give voice to the fulfillment and the happiness that we can find in small acts of kindness under that ceiling on our way up to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan, for describing for us the story, a really touching story, of how you discovered the particularly feminine way to be a Navy pilot and how difficult that was when officers and others struggled to accept you as a female peer. Women's empowerment and gender equality doesn't require women to dress like men and shouldn't require them to divest themselves of their feminine gifts. The third member of our panel is Anne Kyoko, founder and director of the African organization For the Family. She is a member of board of the Family Life Commission of the Kenyan Conference of Catholic Bishops, as well as regional campaign manager for Citizen Go in Africa. She has degrees in law, communications, and sociology, and has been one of the leaders in Kenya in matters concerning the protection of human life and the family. She also organized March for the Family just before President Obama visited Kenya to oppose any push for the same-sex marriages, and several marches for life, life symposia, leadership awards for Christians, prayer breakfasts, and engagement events with Christian members of parliament. She is a popular presence on radio and television, writes for leading secular papers in Kenya, and speaks widely at pro-marriage and pro-family conferences. She will speak about how the priorities that the international community should have with regard to women, especially in developing countries. Anne, it's a pleasure to welcome you to the United Nations. You have the floor.
Thank you so much, Father. Your Excellencies, fellow panelists, dear ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I'd first want to thank the Holy See and CFAM for putting together this side event and for the opportunity that they granted me. I am a woman who has grown up almost her entire life in the village, in the called Nyandarua Abadeas in Kenya, where my mom still lives today. I have grown up fetching water from the borehole, mostly far from my own homestead. And if you look keenly on top of my head, there's a bump resulting from these trips that I was making to fetch water. This water had and still has large amounts of fluorine. And we often got sick and had to be rushed to hospitals. Actually, these were not hospitals, but medical centers. I'm lucky I survived some of these trips. Some of my neighbors did not. And even if they did, many could not get the treatment they needed due to lack of proper healthcare facilities in my area. I remember in one trip, my mom had to carry me on her back for over 10 kilometers. I was very ill, and she needed to get me very fast to the hospital. The hospital was located very far away, and she had to climb hills with me holding onto her back. Even after getting to the hospital, she was told that some of the medication was not there, and so she had to rely on heavens to get me healed. To date, she still thanks heavens for having me healed. I went to a school that was very shabby. The teacher would come from the little rundown staff room on her way to class. When it rained, the building flooded, and we could not go to school. But we endured all this, and all the long barefoot trips back and forth in pursuit of an education. For my homework, I had to get it done before sunset because we did not have electricity, and the paraffin was very expensive to have the lamp lit. Thanks to some scholarships, I was able to get an education, and today that's why I'm seated here in a room with other educated women from across the globe. I come here to represent not only myself, but also many other women in villages and countries like mine who cannot speak for themselves. We cannot ignore the impact that the United Nations has, and some of its policies and agendas have especially in a country like the one I come from. I've always hoped that one day the international community can fully get its priorities correct. I always have hope, especially each year when the commission takes place. On behalf of myself and the women that I'm representing today here, but I'm usually disappointed every other year. I will never stop hoping, though, that one day the United Nations and these international organizations will have the agenda and priorities correct. Contrary to what the negotiators of some countries argue here or try to get in outcome documents, and some UN agencies try to push on countries in the developing world, a young girl in a village like mine does not need contraceptives to be empowered. She does not need policies that prioritize abortion. She does not need destructive curricula like is encompassed in comprehensive sexuality education that have always reduced young girls and women to sexualization. This girl wants to be empowered with policies that include accessibility to a proper, high-quality education and to attend good schools that are not run down and that do not flood when it rains. She hopes for good hospitals that have proper medication, that are near, that are accessible, and that are well built. My mom today still doesn't have piped water because it is also a very expensive affair for my government to do. A girl in my village hopes that when she is bitten by a mosquito that has malaria in it, she is able to get quick and a very proper medication so that she does not die from malaria. We need policies that recognize that a woman with access to electricity can accomplish so much. We need assistance to teach her not only to read and write, but also to impart proper skills that will prepare her for a good career. This is what a woman in my village, a woman in the Abadeas, a woman in Kenya, a woman in Malawi needs. Instead, however, we are hearing in these halls that giving a young girl deeper provera will empower her. Contraceptives like this have been rejected, especially in developed countries, like here in the United States and other European countries, because of the effects that they have, especially later in their lives. You see, we give these young girls contraceptives when they are young, but we are not telling them when later in their life, these contraceptives have some risks. For example, exposing them to cancer risks, to infertility, and to brittle bones. But this is what some international organizations say will improve the lives of young girls. I'm a feminist, don't be mistaken, who also believes that every girl has a right to life from the moment of conception until that of natural death. Every child deserves a right to live, and neither the United Nations nor any type of international agreement or national law can ever justly decree to take that away. I and the women I represent here, I'm trying to echo here. I want everyone to know that abortion is not and can never be healthcare. In my country, abortion is illegal, and this is encompassed in the Kenyan Constitution of 2010, Article 26, Part A. And this, it clearly says that life begins at the moment of conception. That is my own constitution. But why must we continue to see United Nations bodies, for example, UNFPA, the WHO, and their partners, which include Marriage Stops International, IPPF, that is Planned Parenthood, the so-called SRHR Alliance, IPAS, that comes from here in America, and others that tell us that giving a mother the right to take her life of her baby in the womb is essential to her empowerment. Last year in my country, we had to stop Marriage Stops International from advertising abortions in the streets of Nairobi, as if they were advertising candy. Actually, in about 72 hours, 5,000 Kenyans had signed a petition by Citizengo demanding that Marriage Stops license be revoked from Kenya. They were also caught administering contraceptives to schoolgirls without the consent of the parents. Marriage Stops International has been caught not once but many times administering abortions at a small fee, actually, of 5,000. That is about $50 US. The same organization has partnered with UNFPA, SRHR Alliance, IPAS, and others. Actually, they have formed a coalition in my own country. And this is just what they are doing in every other African country and other countries from the developing world. And we caught them sneaking, the word starts with me. This is a kind of comprehensive sexuality education that sexualizes kids in about 50 Kenyan schools without the approval of the Kenyan government or those of the parents. When abortion is prioritized to women like those in my country, it is not the women we are protecting. It is the bloodthirsty abortion industry that is represented by those organizations that I've just mentioned here. In 2014, a survey showed that in Kenya, 82% Kenyans do not support abortion. And today, even if you walk in the streets of Kenya, you will hear women echoing that. Yet abortionists have created sensational statistics to try to brainwash international bodies that we need to legalize abortion. Coming to the Commission on the Status of Women is very hard for me. I sit in many side events here. The same organizations that do such damage in my country are present here. They are pretending to represent the women in the grassroots. It is time we brought the women from the grassroots to the table. We need to hear from the women themselves, not from these organizations like Marriage Stops. These women at the grassroots, they will tell you what they need. They will tell you they don't need abortion. They don't need contraception. They don't need sexualization of women or of their girl child to be empowered. None of this leads to, abortion doesn't lead to empowerment. The women carrying the water cans, the women carrying their daughters on their backs to go to get a hospital or healthcare, they will never tell you that they need such kind of priorities. They need fully equipped health centers. They need good schools. They need clothing. They need food on their tables. They need electricity. And they need to be imparted with proper skills so that they can be good career women. And it is time the social protection agenda at the UN prioritizes this. As for me, I'm not giving up. I'll keep speaking out. I'll keep looking forward to that day the United Nations and those who are speaking and working for the women of the world will get our priorities and the priorities of the women and the grassroots correct. Thank you for your attention and for whatever help you can give to make that hope a reality.
Thank you very much, Anne, for describing for us with great candor how difficult it is for you to listen to the debates during the Commission on the Status of Women. Sounds familiar? When the priorities discussed are so foreign to the needs of Kenyan women and girls, particularly those in villages. Thanks, too, for challenging with your stories the international community to recalibrate properly its priorities. I'm glad to see that Kenya has a future. And our final panelist is Lila Rose, a speaker, writer, and human rights activist. She founded and serves as president of Life Action, a nonprofit dedicated to ending abortion and inspiring a culture that respects all human life, which through social media reaches several million people weekly. A native of the San Francisco area, she has appeared frequently on US national television and radio programs, and her investigative reporting on the abortion industry has been featured in leading news outlets, including the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, Politico, and USA Today. She speaks internationally on family and cultural issues and has addressed members of the European Parliament and spoken before here at the CSW. She has been named among Red Alert's 30 under 30, National Journal's 25 most influential Washington women under 35, and Christianity Today's 33 under 33. She will speak to us about transforming our understanding of woman and motherhood so that we embrace and celebrate a woman's unconditional worth and foster her full well-being from the beginning of her life onward. Lila, welcome back to the United Nations. Many have been waiting eagerly to hear you. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Your Excellencies, and all the distinguished panelists here, Anne and Sue and Susan. And thank you so much to the Holy See and to CFAM for organizing this very important panel. I think what we just heard from our last panelists, ending with Anne's very powerful statements, are very important. They are words that should be heard by every delegate that is present at this Commission on the Status of Women. They are words that every single United Nations delegate should hear and should consider. And unfortunately, they are all too often ignored. And that's why we're here. We're here because we acknowledge that there is a global crisis right now in how women are seen and treated by policies that are pushed by some of the most powerful nations in the world and wealthiest nations in the world. And I first apologize for the actions of my own nation in pushing abortion on demand, in pushing contraceptives as a healthcare solution for women, in pushing ideologies that turn women against their families and do not see women in their holistic, in the holistic reality of who we are, for our families, for our spiritual and physical health, for our potential creativity and the work that we can contribute to the world, but instead all too often in public policy limits us to be turned against our children. And this is something that the United States has all too often done by both the funders in this country and by the policies that we both have here at home and that we advance internationally. The global crisis that we face has many victims. The first victim of this global crisis, which turns women against their children, which sees motherhood as something antithetical to women's advancement, is the fact that there are 27 million girls killed every single year globally. 27 million girls. I mean, this should be the top issue discussed here this week. 27 million girls are being killed in the womb, some of them just because they are girls, slaughtered by abortions. Abortions that are done in the name of the advancement of women and the empowerment of women, but they do anything but, and they are killing 27 million girls. That's 74,871 girls a day, 3,120 girls every single hour. In the time this panel has taken, over 3,000 girls have lost their lives, some of them in countries like India and China, even in parts of the United States, simply because they are girls, because of sex-selective abortions. We have to respond to this global crisis, which not only harms these girls, but harms women. As Anne described very eloquently, harms women in countries that are struggling to advance, to build infrastructure, to respond to the community's needs for food, for proper health care, for education, for economic advancement, but instead are viewed by organizations like the United Nations Population Fund as a target for contraceptives, for IUDs, for harmful hormonal contraceptives that do not help this woman advance, for sex education ideology that is not actual body education of a woman's fertility in her body, but instead has a moral system or a value system that is turned upside down, that is not something that is the deeply held beliefs of many of the people that are being targeted by these ideologies. And so girls are victims, but women are also victims. How do we respond to this crisis? I want to share just a few thoughts about how these barriers have come into place, which are stopping our authentic advancement as women, and then respond with what I think is the ultimate solution. There are many solutions that need to be built out. This whole week should be discussions about how we can actually advance women, not sell them short and view their motherhood, view their fertility as threats. Unfortunately, that's often not the case of what's being discussed this week, but that should be the focus. How do we truly, holistically advance women? And then I'm hopeful we'll have a few minutes left for questions. But I want to share 4 things that I think are barriers to authentic advancement for women today globally. First of all, the promotion of false rights. The promotion of false rights and ideologies about what is truly our empowerment. This blocks authentic advancement. This makes the priority for organizations in the United Nations that are trying to do good in developing countries, the priority becomes things like abortion. And as we know, abortion is not a human right. Abortion violates the fundamental human right to life. And it is an outrage to say to a woman that you can be advanced and empowered by trampling on your young, by trampling on your children. Instead, let's equip and empower and support women to be able to embrace the life within and have the support that they need instead of turning them against their children. These are humans too. The United Nations has even recognized in their Declaration on Human Rights that all members of the human family should be considered people by law and by policy. All members of the human family. A child in the womb is a member of the human family and should be considered and treated as such. So false rights are barriers to our advancement. Secondly, when our fertility as women, which is a sign of health, fertility is a sign of health. When our fertility as women is viewed as a sickness to be treated with drugs, instead of that sign of health and something to be understood about our bodies, most girls, even in the United States, when they're given sex education, are not told and taught how their cycles work. We don't really understand and appreciate our cycles. We treat conditions that we may have with hormonal drugs immediately instead of going deeper to the root of the problem so that women's bodies are perpetually in a state of thinking they're pregnant with hormonal drugs. This is very harmful. There's a litany of harm that these drugs cause to women, including death and cancers, and yet many women and young girls are never told this. We need to stop viewing fertility as a sickness to be treated. And by the way, the reason this is done is to somehow make women be able to compete or to be at the level of men who are constantly fertile. Men have constant fertility, and to live out an ideology that is being placed on us that somehow sexual promiscuity, sexual experimentation is a good thing, when that violates the moral codes of many women who say, no, my body is a gift, my body is something that I treasure, and I'm not going to just use it or abuse it with whomever, and I'm going to have moral choices that guide how I choose to be intimate. And I want to choose to be intimate with someone who will respect me lifelong and treat me well and look to potential children with that same respect and good treatment. That's what women deserve. But instead, our fertility is being viewed as a sickness to be treated. And that's being pushed on developing nations instead of responding to real needs that the nations may have. Third barrier to authentic advancement is expecting women to be just like men. We are not men. Our differences to men are something to be celebrated. Our differences with men are something to be celebrated. We have many similarities, many of the same with men, but our difference, our ability to be mothers, just like they have the unique ability to be fathers, but us to carry children, that needs to be celebrated and championed, instead of looked down upon and denigrated and held as some sort of a barrier to advancement. So if we cannot compete just like men. I thought Susan's story was a beautiful example of treasuring that, even in the man's world. And that's something that needs to be encouraged more for young girls. And then finally, the final barrier to true advancement is when we view children as the problem. When we look at the future of humankind, and if we look at the future and we think about it in terms of limiting populations, in terms of stifling populations, especially populations in poorer countries, in less developed countries, that is not the solution. Children are our future. This planet, we want to protect it and care for it because of the children in the future that will enjoy it. Children are a gift, and we need to celebrate them as such and develop our communities and our policies to support children who are our future. And finally, I think that the solution here is to not abolish the differences between men and women, to not pretend that they don't exist, to not look down on a woman's fertility, her ability to be a mother, but instead to celebrate them and to champion them, because these are exactly the differences that make the world go round, that make future generations possible, that make us stronger and better. It's what we should celebrate. It's why I've dedicated my life at Live Action to working to stop the abuses of abortion and to transform the way we view femininity and womanhood. And I hope that because of the advocacy of Anne, the journalism of Sue, the stories of Susan and her advocacy and the work of CFAM and the Holy See and others that are here today, if you're here today, you have a special mission. We need every person in this room to spread this message and to demand better for women and for our children. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Laila, for highlighting for us how the ideology that expects women to behave like men, especially in the workplace, despite their biological differences, and that separates her good as a woman from her maternal instincts, does violence to women. Thanks, too, for speaking out so forthrightly as a woman of how abortion is often used to target girls before birth, out of a failure to appreciate and protect both their feminine and human dignity. We are running almost out of time, but I think I can take a couple of questions. If you would like to make a comment or ask a question to one of our panelists, please press the call button at your place, identify yourself. First, wait until I call on you. I would ask that you keep your questions and comments exceedingly brief so that we may take them in the short time we have. And I will take a few at a time.
Good afternoon, Your Excellencies, delegates, and local NGOs. My name is Valentin Camano. I am a UN Youth Representative, Delegations Overseas Outreach for Man Up campaign. And my question to everyone, or to whomever can speak of this sensitive topic, In most developing countries, from Mexico, abortion is considered taboo. Not only in Latin America and the Caribbean, and also in some developing countries. How can we engage this sensitive topic? We have to also consider women's right to choice. So how can we develop? It's considered a right to our health, to our own bodies, because how can we learn in the educational system of these countries to promote health education for women's rights?
Hello. My name is Faith Yusko. I serve as a full-time faith-based volunteer within our Catholic community. I have more of a comment than a question. I was really inspired by the speakers that we had sharing their work with us today. And I've also been inspired by a lot of Catholic sisters and lay women who I've had the privilege to work with. So I think our Catholic Church can lead by example in valuing women's roles as feminine role models, as leaders within our family units, and our ability to serve our communities as Pope Francis discerns the Commission study on the ordination of women deacons. As we know, women are essential to peace building in our world and peace and healing within our own Catholic Church, and should be a part of the leadership structure of the world around us. So I'd be interested to hear some of our speakers' thoughts, and again, I'm anxiously waiting to hear about that commission coming from the Pope, and look forward to continuing to grow in my faith and serve my community. Thank you.
Thank you for the questions. First, to answer the gentleman over here, you said, what about a woman's right to choose? And my answer is, to choose what? What are they choosing? What does an abortion do? We use these phrases and these words, and these were invented carefully to mislead people. Sue told some of this story as an investigative journalist. These terms, reproductive justice as a mask for abortion, choice as a mask for abortion, to choose what? If everybody here agrees, and I think they do, that it is never right to intentionally take an innocent human life. It's never right to intentionally take an innocent human life. And if we know that there is a life in the womb and he or she is innocent and abortion intentionally ends her life, then it is never right to commit an abortion. This is not women's empowerment. So I think that's something very important. We have to change the way we're looking at this entirely, and not look down on countries that have laws against abortion, but instead look to them. I mean, I wish the United States was more advanced and more protective of life, like Mexico has more protections than we do here. We don't even ban sex-selective abortion here. You can kill a girl just because she's a girl in the United States. You can kill a baby through all 9 months in the United States. That's choice. No, that's not choice. That's the ending of a life. That's murder. So to respond to the other woman, I'm sure there's other thoughts here, but I'm a Catholic too, and I think that we need more Catholic women standing up in the church, and I'm glad to hear that that's what you're working to do, because more voices, the better. I'm interested in Anne's thoughts on the question.
Okay, thank you. On the right to choice, I would like to say, when you come to my village and you want to tell a woman that they should have a right to choose killing their own baby, they will be surprised. Because in my village, a child is a blessing. And actually, we always have a ceremony to celebrate the incoming of a baby. It's actually a joy for the whole village, not just for the family, but for the whole village. So when you tell me it's a right to choose, right, I don't understand. And at the end of the day, when you say it's a choice to do what? To kill an unborn baby, a preborn baby, to take a life. It's plainly murder. That's all I can say. Thank you.
Where did we get this slogan? You have to watch out for these propaganda slogans. Where did we get the slogan that a woman has a right to control and own her own body? That slogan was made up by Larry Lader in collusion with, or in cooperation with Margaret Sanger. And I think we have to ask, when we say a woman has the right to own and control her own body, when we give her contraceptives, an abortion, who's really owning and controlling her body? The contraceptive industry, the abortion industry, and the man she's having sex with. She's not in charge of her own body at all.